Good evening, and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program on this segment Robert J. Lifton. And Dr. Lifton is a distinguished professor at the John Jay College branch of the City University of, City University of New York.
Right.
And welcome very, very much. And he's the author of, among other, many other books, The Future of Immortality, and has written on the questions of some of the major issues of confronting us in the moment, and welcome very, very much to Conversations. We were talking off camera a little bit before, where we stand in terms of the psychological implications of the technology, the extensions of our consciousness, particularly the destructive aspects. I asked you, and you said I might ask you on camera, and I would. Have we reached that Promethean point in the outering of our consciousness in the form of weapons, where if they were unleashed, in a mistake?
I may be your only guest who welcomes that cosmic question, but
have we reached the point where if it was unleashed, we could render or see our rendering of the whole of the Earth habitat incapable of the continuation or the survival of our species?
There's no doubt that we've either reached the point or we're close to it. That is, the scientists can argue among themselves, the physicists, whether nuclear winter is a complete truth or only a partial truth, but all the evidence is that we can come very close through our technology of destruction, of destroying all of human life, including the life of many of the other species. And that has to have enormous human impact and enormous psychological impact. It's what I call imagery of extinction. Now we live with imagery of extinction, with imagery of the possibility of eliminating ourselves as a species with our own technology.
It's not an extension on an individual basis of the inevitability of death itself? Or
it's an extension, and it's something more. I know that I'm going to die. Like other human beings, I resist that knowledge. But it makes it even more difficult for me if I think everything and everyone is going to die as well. And when I interviewed people in Hiroshima, and they told me about their feelings at the time the bomb fell, they said not only did they feel that they were about to die, but they looked around them and they felt that the whole world was dying. And that's an added dimension which makes death itself more unacceptable. Death is relatively acceptable to us. We never accept it fully, but it's relatively acceptable if we're older and have lived a full life and have realized some of our potential and leave behind us.
And see a continuation of the species.
See a continuation of our own families, of our own works, of our relation to nature, of our religious ideas, and of, yes, aspects of the human experiment that we've been part of, you know. And if that's all threatened, so is the meaning of our own lives. And that's being felt now very strongly.
And it is interesting that that's only happened in our lifetime. Second war, we were trying hard as we could, the arsenals, to put out the weapons of destruction.
Yes.
I said earlier, we could have done it in the past if everyone would have lined up side by side and stuck each other in the heart with a knife, but that's improbable. But now, in the hands of one man, one person perhaps, could make a mistake that would, in an interlinking way, trigger these weapons. And it's done, this event, or this occurrence, or this achievement of this level of destructive capability has occurred in our lifetime, to the time in which we...
I agree.
Against a 200,000-year sweep of human history.
There's a terrible turning point at the end of World War II. And I don't think human beings are any worse now than they were in the past. It's the change in technology and our relationship to it. Now look, it's true that the Turks killed over 1 million Armenians, mostly in 1915, mostly with guns and clubs, in that genocide that has been neglected. But still, they didn't have the technology to perform what's now called omnicide, the death of everything. And even the Nazis, they came closer, and the gas chambers were the highest technology of mass murder available at the time. And they could kill as many as 10,000 or even 20,000 people within 24 hours at Auschwitz. That's an extraordinary amount of killing. But that doesn't in any way touch, in at least killing potential, nuclear weapons. And really, incidentally, the turning point with nuclear weapons is not even the discovery of the atomic bomb. That's a major turning point, clearly, at the end of World War I. But the sequence from the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb in the early 50s.
54,
yes, well, the work begins in, 49, 50, and then it's produced in 54. But that's the ultimate turning point, because with the hydrogen bomb, the killing potential is infinite. literally infinite. There's no limit to the killing potential. And incidentally, the scientists who tried to head off the making of the hydrogen bomb in one of Oppenheimer's reports, and then in another report that group made, name the weapon as genocidal. It was known and knowable that the hydrogen bomb was a genocidal weapon. That's the key turning point.
And they still proceeded with the research?
And they still proceeded, because at that point we got locked into the Cold War and the fear that the Russians would make it. And Herbert York, who has been very active in the making of weapons but now is a voice for arms control, has re-examined that whole time and said we could have, risked nothing and held back on the making of the hydrogen bomb by just exploring the possibilities, with the Soviet Union particularly, of holding off on making it. It would have been a major step in preventing our moving to this genocidal system that we now are all in.
But we were locked into the historically inherited patterns of national rivalry and so forth,
national rivalries,
unfortunately still seem to be.
Oh yes, we still are, and I think that the whole situation is still very dangerous. I welcome the new détente and the Gorbachev initiative, and even the INF Treaty. It's limited, but it's of some importance. It's the right direction. It's thinking in species terms in a beginning way. But look, the weapons are still pointed at the two countries, and there's the danger of proliferation. We're not out of the woods by any means, and nuclearism, that ideology that's so dangerous, is still rampant.
Yeah, and we hadn't mentioned bacteriological and chemical weapons.
All that. Well, it's sometimes
all part of the occasion.
There's talk of bacteriological and chemical weapons and certain kinds of missiles as the poor man's nuclear weapons. And there's a lot to that idea, because I have felt for a long time that until the superpowers really get serious about radical nuclear disarmament, mutual, getting rid of virtually all of the nuclear weapons, all but a handful, as many plans now put forward, there won't be any chance until that's done of controlling proliferation into other countries, or of controlling the very real danger of chemical and bacteriological weapons.
Or one wonders if there are some basis of social or economic or political injustices in the world which may be the basis for friction between the peoples of the world that lead to war, that it might even call us even to a higher task of finding a elementally just world society that would be able to be perhaps opening on the obverse side of the destruction, which might be a species-wide and positive view of the future of the human prospect.
Well,
it seems very much under threat now by the historically inherited institutions by which we interrelate with one another.
Yes, it's a kind of a double process right now. We've been talking about the genocidal system that we're now in. The system of weapons and people, which could blow up virtually all human life very quickly on the planet. But at the same time, once one recognizes that, there is the beginning glimmers of species consciousness, species mentality, and the species self. And it works something like this. Once I recognize that nuclear winter or something close to it is real, then I have to say to my Soviet counterpart, if you die, I die. If I survive, you survive. We're in it together. That's what Buckminster Fuller meant by Spaceship Earth. We're on the same planet. And once I do that, I begin to recognize that every other sense of self is bound up with my sense of self, and vice versa, the beginning of a species self. And then I still go on being what I am. I'm an American and a psychiatrist and a doctor and a teacher and a father and a husband and a Jew and a few other things. But in addition to those, I take on that species commitment, and as a member of the human species, I also look at issues, ethical and political questions, and I'm more able to feel the pain of a black South African when he's treated or she's treated brutally by that regime, or by a Czech political heretic, or for that matter, by the homeless in this country right here in New York. And more people have that. It isn't new, it's just newly necessary, and I think it's increasing. So we have these two forces, one of destruction, potentially, of everything, and the other of a more inclusive sense of identity, which is describable in pragmatic terms psychologically, that would enormously enhance the human condition.
Empathy? Empathy is
part of it, yes.
And are you, I don't want to say sandwich and the sense of empathy for people, underclass peoples of our own nation?
Sure. Once I
the world, do you feel that that is growing in terms of the consciousness, let's say, of the people of the United States, that we are sufficient? It looks a little hard in New York City, where people walk over the homeless, or a nation where a government will operate with very, very little sense of regard for the underclass peoples of the world, or have a philosophy or a political philosophy that allow us to resonate to the needs of the underclass peoples of the world.
Sure.
Do you think we have enough sense of that, or a vision of how we could operate and establish our institutions that would give us a sense of resonating to a new way of operating, other than just geopolitical jungle law that seems to have been in the saddle more recently in many people's view of the world?
Well, you know, I can't give a yes or no answer to that, and I don't even like to deal in terms of optimism or pessimism, but yes, we're capable of that, so there's hope for that. We can imagine that species consciousness, because partly it exists. So it's one aspect of human capability, and you see more and more of it. You know, we have an international doctors movement that I'm active with, international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war, and it won the Nobel Prize. And but the whole spirit of that group, we have, you know, doctors all over the world who, instead of being simply preoccupied with making more money through their fees, or whatever doctors are most preoccupied with most of the time, they care on an international human species level with heading off this ultimately threatening dimension to human health. You know, the nuclear weaponry.
Right, it's a health issue.
That's what we call it, and take hold of as an issue. It's a species mentality that takes shape from people all over the world, and there are corresponding groups of other kinds. So yes, it's increasing, but we've got to make it happen faster and have it spread more rapidly to more people. I think here the media have some usefulness, because they spread some of these things, although they also spread opposite tendencies toward narrow, call it fundamentalist positions that we see very rampant as well.
Yeah, and that's a problem of the time which we find ourselves in. To try and get a hold of that large theme, and so you said earlier, and I don't want to be nitpicking or anything of that sort, the growth of that, we are able to see the abolition of the species. We can't yet see the abolition of life itself, which is even a more precious liaison in a certain sense that this very small planet has in terms of the cosmos. I don't suppose we can't see that kind of an entropy in terms of the operation of universe and so forth.
We don't know that. In other words, we don't know whether our weaponry, if really made use of fully, could destroy even the potential for life. It would be hard to do, but not impossible, given our destructive power.
Phosphorescent worms at the bottom of the ocean deeps.
But here's the way to look at it. Here's one way to look at it anyhow. When I speak of symbolic immortality in my work, in the book of essays you mentioned, and in earlier work, I really mean that sense we require over the course of our lives, not just when we're close to death, but over the course of our lives, that we're part of something larger than ourselves. It's a symbolization of larger human connectedness. It's a symbolization of the fact that we are the historical animal and the cultural animal. So in emerging as Homo sapiens, we learn that we die, we create culture, and we symbolize. And we can more readily accept death if we feel comfortable in being part of some kind of human chain.
Yes, right.
And that human chain we feel to be threatened. It doesn't give me much solace to think, well, still the potential for some life, the phosphorus or whatever, is still there somewhere, even after the nuclear holocaust.
That's just an extension of the idea of empathy with something other than self.
Yes, but I prefer the empathy.
Itself.
I prefer that,
because in a certain sense, the human species is, in a certain sense, a special case experience in terms of life form.
But I think it's very important that we
which gets a little bit.
It's good to have empathy for, say, other species.
For the ultimate ecological kind of.
Yes, and the ecological thinking is very helpful, because I think we're much better human beings when we feel ourselves ecologically bound up with the other species.
And at a very real level, consciousness is a seamless web.
Yes. However, our empathic need now, our overwhelming empathic need now, is for other human beings.
Yeah.
It's a problem of the human mind and a problem of empathy for other human beings. And once you move into species awareness and species consciousness, the empathy comes, and it's very, very important.
Yeah, very important. And if we were saying before, we're taking this this very doomsday kind of picture of that, the obverse side of a scenario that would see us destroying, let's say, human species and so on, the obverse side of that, given against a 200,000-year sweep when humanity first appeared in evolution or something, might be opening upon, because we have tremendous technological capability for providing what Buckminster Fuller would have called livingry, to perhaps alleviate the scourges that have, in a material sense, plagued mankind and so forth. We have the ability to provide life support for the peoples of the world in an unprecedented capability. It might be possibly opening upon the notion of something that has been thought of throughout the human experience as a liberating condition. James Joyce did say, had Daedalus say, that history is a nightmare from which we are awakening. At some point we will awaken to a way of consciousness transcendent to what we've been throughout the human experience, perhaps in touch with it.
Well,
if you understand,
I understand what you're saying, but I don't want to put myself quite in that position. Let me explain what I want to say about that. I think we have to stay with our history. It's the only history we have.
Yes.
I don't think we can transcend our history, but we can move to another place in our history. And I do agree with part of what you said in terms of the potential for technological mass destruction of virtually everyone and everything on the one hand, and at the same time reaching a consciousness of the oneness of the human species and its dependency upon other species. Now, I don't think we should put too much dependence on technology as such. It is true that we have increasingly finer technology that could help alleviate a lot of medical and social problems in the third world. But what we've gotten into the habit of doing, and even Fuller might not have been free of this habit, is to replace human solutions with technological solutions.
Technology is an extension of our consciousness.
It is, but we need to really work through human problems on human terms and then bring the technology under human control, as opposed to seeing the technology as the savior. Because that has all kinds of dangers. It won't be the savior unless we know what to do with it, and unless we have certain visions, I would say, of species awareness that allow us to put the technology in the right places and at the service of the right groups and to help with starvation. And that is part of a human consciousness. I don't think it's transcending human consciousness. I'm not making it even a mystical achievement.
Yeah, right.
It's rather a further step in psychological and historical capability, which we have, at least potentially, as human beings. And I think there may be something to the idea that we arrive at that possibility as greater than before. Our possibilities for species awareness is much greater than before, even because of the awareness of the destructiveness of our technology.
Yeah, might be able to see that as birth pangs, or if that's right. I don't know if it's right to think in terms of this as having
It's been known before. I mean, people know it ahead of their times, like Jesus or Gandhi or Martin Luther King and others, maybe Moses or Abraham. But it's very hard to live up to. But now it's become pragmatically available and pragmatically necessary in a historical and an evolutionary sense, and more people have elements of it. But all sorts of things are in the pot, you know, and I think that the notion of species awareness or species consciousness is very threatening to some groups, and contending with it you have fundamentalist groups that are more narrow, politically and religiously.
Yeah, nationalism right back to selfish individuals.
Nationalism or political sectarianism. And, you know, in extreme expression you might find neo-Nazis in this country, or you might find various fundamentalists religiously and politically, and you see them in the Middle East among Jews and among Arabs, and you see them in Africa and in Asia. There's a kind of worldwide epidemic of fundamentalism that's very dangerous.
Which would seem to be speaking a deep-seated sense of insecurity, perhaps, and at a psychological level, which the times would, in a sense, call for. You'd be well aware of that. There must be a deep level of insecurity among people of the world, and they will go to get a sense of identity in terms of their roots? Or
that's right. No, that's very close to, I think, in which fundamentalism arises when the fundamentals are feared to be threatened.
I think maybe that's what I meant by trying to get above or a systems understanding of some of the historical patterns by which we've related. Fuller used to talk about the possibility of the technology perhaps ushering to us, getting us to a point where through exponential increase of providing living, we might be able to have an understanding of the world which sees an opening upon sufficiency in a material sense, rather than, and maybe even onto surplus in a material sense, rather than scarcity, which is in the context within which all of human institutions had evolved. Yes, that was a fundamental breaking point that he would see.
But you see, simply producing that technology doesn't do it. In other words, the technology can replace scarcity with abundance. But for that to happen, it needs certain attitudes of the human mind to combine with the technology to bring it about. I fear that in Fuller's message there was too much of the sense, even if he didn't believe this or say it directly, it could be inferred by some from the way he did speak, too much of the sense that the technology would solve it for us. The extraordinary technological leaps which are real would solve these human problems. The technological leaps don't solve the human problems. They potentially solve them if we can combine a certain cast of mind that is species-oriented with that wonderful breakthrough in technology.
Yeah, I thought he always would take it the synergies, the behavioral systems unpredicted by the sum of the parts. If we could arrive at an order where we live in many ways in an oppressive order, where many of the best human potentialities of the individual...
But that process, I would say, is very much an ethical and a political process.
Yes.
Now, it's not going to come automatically. It has to be fought for. It needs movements and groups that see these things internationally and universally. For instance, but I could see these things happening. I just said at the earlier meeting that when I was in Hiroshima, a lot of people in Hiroshima, where I spoke because I've worked there and written about Hiroshima, people asked me about my work in regard to the Nazis, which I've worked at more recently. When I was in Germany, and people were very concerned about not only my work and others on the Nazi era and the Nazi doctors, but also my work and others in Hiroshima. And I began to think that for the people in Hiroshima to really confront their experience, and for the Germans to confront what they were part of in terms of the Nazi era, well, the people in Hiroshima had to look at the Nazis, and the Germans had to look at Hiroshima, had to look at, because these are both part of our potential for destructiveness, and to look at the other is to transcend that potential and move into species consciousness. And that's really happening, but is it happening fast enough and widely enough? That's the question.
Yeah, species consciousness, species-wide empathetic consciousness, and the realization of an organic nature, or consciousness or a human expression.
I would start out more modestly and say it's a question of identity. I could see it in my sense of self or your sense of self. That there are different elements that go into my sense of identity or my sense of self or yours or anyone else's, and the sense of being a human being and part of the human species, and therefore bound up with all other members of the species, becomes in this way a very important part of my everyday sense of self. That means when certain issues come up, whether it's the issues of oppression in South Africa, or events in Central or South America, or in Eastern Europe, or anywhere, or in the United States, in terms of the extraordinary polarization of this society economically between the very rich and the very poor, which is getting worse and worse and more polarized. In all these situations, if I take on a species self, yes, I develop empathy for others who are different, who are at a different end of the socioeconomic scale in this country, or a different color, or a different nationality, or different origins, or whatever. Many people throughout the world have much of that already, but how much can it take hold so that it helps condition their decisions, the way they vote, the way they live their lives, you know? And it's at least hopeful that this can expand and spread, and certainly much of my life is committed to that effort.
Indeed it is, and I could come back to something you said before. You said that it's understood, in a certain sense, or it could be understood, that the adverse side of the destructive capability is the possibility of a material world order in which sufficiency or even an opening on surplus for all, that's livingry, could be provided for all, is something that's understood.
Well,
it seems to me, if I may,
I don't think it's understood. No, I didn't say it was understood.
It can't be taken as a paradigm or a context within which human institutions could be formulated that there is enough rather than there's not enough. That this is a context for which human institutions, international order and so forth, could be formulated within an understanding of there being sufficiency. Has that dawned, or is it ever announced in the halls of our government, or do our national governments, or even our United Nations representatives think in terms, materially, of there being enough for all? And what would be the context of possibility open to deliberative bodies that could be administering, as it were, a world technological human system in the understanding of sufficiency? There is enough.
You need there is sufficiency. There's enough food and there are enough resources to take care of people in the world but once you bring in the it's a very major contingency. If they're properly husbanded and nurtured and distributed, that's an enormous if. To improve that nurturing of the resources and the food and the distribution so people don't starve and have the capacity to live and to live reasonably decently. To do all that requires altering the institutions. The United Nations isn't much better than the individual countries that form it.
We've inherited all of these inherited patterns of thinking.
So we have to, I agree with you, we have to project these possibilities of being able to do this, of rendering the resources and the food sufficient for the people in the world. And we have to, at the same time, be pressing for the consciousness, the universal species consciousness that would enable us or motivate us to do it. There are more and more people who see things with that moral perspective, but they're not the people who run the great powers in our world or who hold the power in most of the nations of the world. So what happens, I think, is that lots of governments lots of leaders in countries take on glimmerings of a species mentality. Gorbachev and Reagan could go far enough to recognize that a nuclear war fully fought is not recoverable from or winnable, and therefore our mission together, the two countries, is to cooperate sufficiently to prevent that from happening. That's the beginning of species mentality. There's not enough of it, and it isn't carried through consistently enough. But that has to be worked on simultaneously with the technological and institutional projections. Sure, I'm for them, but it isn't that we're there, it's that we have the potential for being there. That's
you don't think the metaphor of birth, we gestate, and that we're about to perhaps have a fundamental or qualitative
I'm in favor
renaissance with ourselves and our relationship to the universe, that we may be at a point, not transcending, just as all consciousness is relating, but at some point in future time, there will be a consciousness or an awareness that is transcendent to what we have been throughout this human experience. It might be called liberation in the terms of some of our philosophers and prophets and so forth, but it's an extraordinary time perhaps of birth and we've been gestating.
Well,
maybe opening upon...
I like what you say, but I don't want to put it that way, because I fear that by putting it that way, it seems to relieve us of the tough, painful, grubby human struggle we have to go through to realize that.
Here in the womb of human consciousness.
Here, right here, on the earth and in our city and right around us. So we're capable of altering our consciousness toward a species awareness. We're capable of, therefore, changing human history, but it's from within history and as a continuation of human history. When you put it in mystical terms, whether they're technological or not, or partially technological, when you depend too much on metaphor, I think, without meaning to do so perhaps, it runs the danger of not focusing on the nitty-gritty struggles that are necessary. So I want to see it in terms of where we are now in psychological and historical and political terms, and how we might go from A to B, but I also want to see it with sufficient vision. I want to be sufficiently visionary to include in the equation that which might be. But I don't want to just put it in mystical terms or in metaphorical terms.
Mystical terms can be very visionary in a very real sense, but you want it has to be in some sort of practical terms that relates to the reality.
That's right, and I want to see it. I want to see it in terms of the combinations we have now, and not to be too quick to see a quantum jump in consciousness as something inevitable. It may occur if we work toward it happening.
Yeah, right. Well, you said the political leadership is very often, isn't it the case where they have the vision of a certain kind of different kind of condition in which
to some extent the
things could be done. We need visionary leadership in our political and leadership. They have a tremendous responsibility for institutions we have inherited, the nation state and the various kinds of things. They tend to have the responsibility, but there is vision that is needed of something that is going to make it possible for us all to get out of the traps that we have been in. Inordinate nationalism, inordinate self-centeredness, and so forth. So I don't know where the vision would...
Well, I think that right now, the people of most countries...
Poets? Or who can bring...
Everybody. The people in general are far ahead of their leaders, mostly. People begin to sense, even the various polls, the polls done by the best student of attitudes in this country, Daniel Yankelovich, show that most Americans recognize that nuclear weapons would destroy virtually everyone, that there's no recovering from nuclear war, and Americans, you know, think that there's a 50-50 chance or something like that of a nuclear war in their lifetime. There's a certain realistic sense they have about nuclear threat which has made its way to them despite the efforts of many of our leaders to fuzz things, to really encourage what I call psychic numbing. Once Americans and people of the world in other countries have similar attitudes, I think, once they have that attitude, they know that we have to come to some terms, as Americans do. The whole freeze movement voting showed us that Americans want to diminish the arms race, but they're afraid of the Soviet Union and so on. But the leaders of the countries fall back on nationalistic cliches, fuel the Cold War in various ways, and haven't reached the sensibility on a species level that many of the people have. That's why a lot of the work in this has to be done outside of governments, and a lot is being done. I mean, I was on a wonderful space bridge, as they call it, program with the Soviet Union, and there are many other things like that, and the doctors group, and there are lawyers groups, and there are teachers groups. There's still just a tiny little portion of what we require, but they're best done outside of governments to build wise pressures onto governments. I think the doctors' movement has been useful because the Soviet representatives to the doctors' movements had to be kosher to the Soviet regime, being the way it works, but they could go back and be a lobby within the regime for nuclear reason, and they were and have been, and they've contributed to the Soviet change in this area, and we like to think that in a modest way we've contributed something too. So lots of effort has to be done outside of governments, and then pressures on governments. And did the doctors of the American system have to be kosher to the American system? And, oh no, that's the ironic thing was that because we have been a much freer country, a much more open society with all of our faults, we could say any damn thing we wanted about our government, and did. And the Soviet doctors could say less about their governments, but on the other hand, we could talk with them as human beings, and they felt very, very strongly, and could bring back a message to their government. We were treated often rudely by our government, and weren't even received formally after receiving the Nobel Prize. I don't think President Reagan was delighted about our receiving the Nobel Prize, because we've been a consistent critic of policies, American policy and Soviet policy, in regard to nuclear weapons buildup. Nonetheless, that freedom to speak out against our government isn't enough. We have to develop consciousness in a way that forces our government to a more reasonable position, and some of that has happened, so that when Reagan knew that he needed political capital, he turned toward peacemaking, not toward nuclear saber rattling. That means, because he's a very astute politician, he and people around him, that means there's some recognition of a consciousness in the direction of humanity and peacemaking taking shape in America that has political importance. We've got to do a lot more of that to make it still more important politically and otherwise.
In the United States, it can be done within more or less the dialogue and the give and take and the self-criticism and so forth can take place within the established institutions and
everywhere. You know, you've got to work out.
You don't need
you've
to
got to
go
work
extra establishment institutions in order to find the vision.
You got to do both. I mean, everything from civil disobedience to casting your vote. For instance, I always try to connect with the Berrigan movement of the Catholic Church, because I think they have a very important message about the evil of the nuclear weapons buildup, and they're demonstrating it. I went to testify at a trial of some of those people just a few weeks ago, and I'll try to always do that. Different people do different things. I write my books and papers, others teach, others demonstrate, and I do that once in a while. There's no one way, and casting your vote and forming intra-establishment political groups are important as well. The whole thing, right across the spectrum.
Yeah, the I guess that's the intra-nature of the thing within the nation here, or within the...
But sometimes it's got to be outside the established institutions. The whole doctors' movement is very mild, it's very conservative really, but it couldn't take shape within the official political organizations, nor should it have, and it took place outside of them. And then there are other groups that are more militant, and we need them all.
We need them all because we're at a time of really, this is, Chinese said, interesting times. We certainly live in interesting times, most interesting times ever, I guess, in the history of the human experience. Well, it just seems to me, if I may, that your work has contributed mightily to the dialogue, for which I personally want to thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Done that. And I certainly want to thank you for participating here in conversation. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Well, I've been very happy to do so.
And I'd like to remind you and the cable television audience, it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Robert J. Lifton, who is, again, distinguished professor at the John Jay College of the New York
City University.
City University of New York. It's your pleasure to have had his perceptions. We invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. That's it for this particular segment. Dr. Lifton, once again, thank you very much for participating and for all your work.
Thank you.
Please stay tuned. We're coming right back.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations 40 years ago, may not be a legally binding document. It is rather a promise made by all the members of the United Nations to the people of the world. We at Amnesty International believe that the governments who have adopted the Declaration have a moral responsibility to keep that promise.
Write Amnesty International, Post Office Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.
This may be the best kept secret in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 40 years ago, the United Nations wrote and adopted it. Every single member country has promised to support it, every single one. They also promised to teach, publicize, and display it. Have you ever heard of it? To get your copy, write Amnesty International, P.O. Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.
Much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Jeremy Rifkin. And Jeremy Rifkin is the author of a book that was extremely important to me, if I may say so, being Entropy. Also a book more recently, Alchemy, and one Time Wars. And Jeremy Rifkin, welcome very much.
Thank you, and thanks for the plugs for the books.
Not at all. They're really very, very good books indeed. They ought to be more read. And as I understand, Entropy has a new edition coming out?
Yes, after 9 years, Entropy is coming out a new edition called Entropy into the Greenhouse World. And that'll be published this month by Bantam and be in all the stores.
That's right. It'll take off from where Entropy left, as it were, and
yes.
It has some additional thought? And so
yes, it will. We're going to be dealing with the entire greenhouse crisis, ozone depletion, and you know, since Entropy was written, we no longer just have an energy crisis. We also have a tremendous pollution crisis for the planet, and so this book's an attempt to bring them both together. Talk about energy shortages and depletion, and at the same time talk about the first global environmental crisis, the greenhouse crisis.
Yeah, it might be worth saying Entropy is
second law
second law of thermodynamics, systems tend to move toward chaos to the limits of the system, and this is something you feel is biological system, human species and so forth, there's no getting around the second law of thermodynamics?
No, there's something in living, for a long time, energy experts thought that maybe living systems violate the laws of thermodynamics. Now we know they don't. There's a field called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Living systems feed off neg entropy. In other words, living systems are able to maintain themselves by continually using energy and in the process dissipating energy, and that's rather obvious, I think.
Yeah, so that it isn't as though the biological system is... Buckminster Fuller used to talk about entropy and used to talk about synergy and seeing the biological evolutionary process itself in a certain sense, in terms of universe, as being in a certain sense anti-entropic, or
no,
he used to use the syntropic to try and bring synergy and anti-entropic function of your biological function, or the biological purpose itself. It moves across entropy and brings some sense of order to universe and so forth.
Well, in a sense, living systems are the most entropic. Anyone that's taken basic biology knows about the food chain. And in the food chain, as you go up the food chain, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to maintain increasingly complex species up the food chain of the living system. In fact, only about 10% of the energy of a victim ever is consumed into the predator in the food chain. The other 90% of the victim's energy is just lost in the transforming process. So living creatures are able to maintain life at the expense of tremendous flow-through of energy and dissipation of energy.
Yeah, and it does. Is there then a concentration of energy as you move up the food chain, as it were?
Yeah, the more complex the living creature, the more concentrated the energy flow through, the more energy is needed to maintain that species. So it's also true with social systems. The more decentralized the system, the less energy it requires. The more complex and centralized a civilization or an infrastructure or an institution, the more energy it requires to maintain it, the more wasted energy in the process.
Yeah. What if we look at the social systems, and you say your new book is coming into looking at the incredible pollution problems, ozone, greenhouse effect, and so forth. What are these systems, or these understandings of entropy, or the laws of physics, the laws of the evolution of a broader sense of the cosmos and so forth, have to tell us about social policy, well, your view?
I think the first thing that we have to understand is the age of growth is an illusion. There's a saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You always pay the bill, and that's really a kind of a popular way of talking about the laws of thermodynamics. The fact is, the greenhouse crisis and the ozone depletion, acid rain, species extinction, that's the price we're paying for 100 years of unbridled economic activity. Now the pollution is building up faster than the planet can absorb and recycle the waste and replenish the stock. And that's all a direct reflection of those laws of thermodynamics. And try as we will, there is no way to escape those laws any more than we can escape the laws of gravity. So we have to learn that there are limits. Let me give you an example. We call this the age of growth. In a sense, though, that it's an illusion. We borrow, but we never grow. Economics is merely the borrowing of resources from the environment. We collect them, transform them into products and utilities, and then they end up as waste or pollution that has to be discarded back into the environment. So we don't grow anything. We just borrow and transfer resources from nature to ourselves back to nature. In fact, even the molecules in my face will be replaced in 7 months from now. My body will be replaced, physically speaking, in about 7 years from now. So even our physical beings are borrowed. Our physicality begins as natural resources. We transform those resources into our being, our physical existence, and they're being discarded at all times back into the environment. So it's interesting. If we grew up, instead of thinking this is the age of growth, if we thought of it as the age of borrowing, we'd have a very different sense of our responsibility to our environment and to our planet. Because when you borrow, you got to pay back. The word is replete with ethics, indebtedness, mutuality, relationship, and give and take. So if we properly understood that all social activity, all economic activity is derivative of the environment, and we're merely borrowing from it for a temporary point of time span, and then it goes back to the environment, if we understood the nature of our indebtedness to the planet we wouldn't have the national debt, we wouldn't have the greenhouse crisis, we wouldn't have acid rain or species extinction, because we would understand our place in the continuum of things between the past and the future.
Would we have the material progress that has been associated with that growth, industrialization and so forth? And how do we deal with the desire seeming on the part of the human species and people of the human societies to have material progress in everyday materialistic terms?
Well, first of all, the age of material progress is, again, a bit of a misnomer. Only a small percentage of the population of this planet have experienced the great material benefits of the industrial fossil fuel era. You know, it's important to point out that 15 to 17% of our species today goes to bed hungry every night. That's the greater percentage of human beings in history that have gone to bed malnourished. Our anthropologists tell us that, from what they gather, in Paleolithic times, we never had a percentage like that, 17% of our species going to bed hungry. In Neolithic times, it was never that great. In antiquity, even in medieval Europe, we never experienced the reality of 17% of our own species malnourished. So this has been the age of progress, narrowly defined, for a small elite within a handful of industrial nations, primarily the United States, Western Europe, and now in Japan. So this has been I would say anthropologists will look back at this age as the age of illusion and as a cruel age, because we sacrifice future generations for short-term whims.
You wouldn't agree with Dr. Fuller's perception that we'd made progress. Technology, electricity, and other kinds of benefits have brought net living possibility, perhaps not realized, but possibility. He said he thought we could even approach the point where we would cross the point where we could leave a condition of fundamental scarcity to one of sufficiency on a world system scale. Such as an illusion?
Yes,
an illusion in your mind.
I think he was a brilliant thinker, but I must say I totally disagree with Bucky Fuller on this. The fact is, tools, when you strip them of their mystique, are just transformers. That's all they do. They don't grow anything. They don't make anything from nothing. They simply transform. Tools are made out of nature's resources. They are used to transform other resources into temporary goods, products, utilities, and then eventually they're discarded. So the faster you accelerate the transformers, the tools, the more power you build into the tools, the faster we exhaust the terrestrial resources, the faster we build up pollution that can't be recycled by nature's own timescale, and the faster we exhaust the base of energy in which future generations have to live. This planet has its own time frame. And our social time is now at odds with our own physical time and our own internal clocks and the clocks of the planet. So in a sense, our environmental crisis is a crisis of time values and of high technology. We are producing and consuming faster than the planet can recycle and replenish. That's why we have species extinction. That's why we have the greenhouse crisis. That's why we have ozone depletion.
And much of that technology we've reached in terms of what Dr. Fuller would have called killingry is in the form of atomic, hydrogen, other kinds of weaponry that really has brought us, after 200,000 years of evolution, to the point where apparently we do have the capability, if we were to geopolitically miscalculate, to render the habitat of the Earth incapable of the continuation of the species. And that, for the first time in 200,000 years of evolution, that we have that potency of destruction.
Well, it's a dual
One
potency.
wonders what the obverse side of that destructive capability might be, and if it might not be something like a liberated condition for us to be able to realize some liberated condition other than... You would disagree with James Joyce's view that history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken, or see in some positive sense the human perspective.
Well, let me try and put it into...
Based in materialistic terms. And one final coda to that. Doctor, you take no exception to, or no heart from Dr. Fuller's thought about ephemeralization, of being able to do more with less so that we don't have to pollute and rape the planet in order to provide living for a increased world, a world of increased population.
Yeah.
And so forth.
Well, let me deal with each one. First of all, I think there's a double threat to the planet. One, obviously, is the threat of nuclear arms, and now biological warfare, genetically engineered warfare, and chemical warfare. For the first time in the long stages of pyrotechnology, and now the first stages of biotechnology, we can destroy the home which we live in. So that is a powerful new reality on the world stage.
It's come since the Second War.
Second World War, since the dropping of those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a second threat that we're only now becoming aware of, and that's the new threat to global security, which is environment. The new threat to the planet is environmental threat, and security increasingly in the coming decade will be defined in terms of global environmental security, because what brings us together now in common peril is the destruction of an entire planet in the solar system. So I think we have the threat of military extinction, and we now have the threat of environmental extinction. So security now has to be defined in a broader context. In terms of what would be the opposite,
the obverse side of a destructive capability.
The adverse side would be developed
100 years out in some positive view of a biological evolutionary purpose in this part of the universe.
We would need to develop a new postmodern philosophy of science. Our science is Baconian science. Francis Bacon laid out the ground rules for the modern age when he said knowledge is power. He believed we could create a subject-object relationship with the environment, detach ourselves, and manipulate nature to our own ends. He believed that the more we could reduce, isolate, and expropriate, the more secure we'd become. That reality ended for us when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We increasingly realize now that more power is less security. Because when the power is so overwhelming that we all become the victims, then the technology is now suspect itself. And the whole prowess of a scientific worldview based on divide, dissect, reduce, and isolate. We could be developing a postmodern science based on empathy with the environment rather than control over it. We could be developing a sophisticated postmodern science of connection and relationship within context.
Science and technology.
And technology. Our science is reduce, divide, dissect. We could create a science based on join, connect, and relate. So the new science of the postmodern world is a science based on empathetic union with the planet. We began to define the planet as a single organism, and we began to define ourselves as a living part of that organism.
A sense of species participation, in a sense.
And a sense of our obligation to the rest of the creation. That it's not just species Homo sapien, but that we have a special obligation to be caretakers and partners with the rest of the creation. It works as a single organism, and we have to begin to understand that in terms of how we organize our civilization.
You don't think the possibility, Dr. Fuller said, that we could be leaving a situation, historical condition of scarcity, which has been the context within which human institutions had formulated, to one of an understanding of sufficiency, or even an opening upon surplus, would be a milieu which would allow for the geopolitical decisions that might allow us to do this. And one last thing, you didn't get a chance to comment on the possibility of ephemeralization or technology of good design that allows us to do more with less in order to try and deal with some of the pollution questions that
this whole idea
obviously confronts us.
Right. This whole idea of no limits, of unlimited growth, of no consequences for our actions, in therapeutic terms, is very reminiscent of an adolescent stage of development. You know, a young child thinks that there are no limits and no consequences, and that one's appetites can be not only voracious but insatiable. The pleasure principle. Our entire civilization is wedded to the pleasure principle in its modern science and technology. We have to graduate to a more sophisticated postmodern philosophy of science, where we realize there are consequences to every one of our actions, and that all of our actions affect everything around us. Now, in terms of the ephemeralization and what's our relationship to future generations, I think Owen Barfield, the great British barrister and philosopher, wrote a very nice little book called Saving of the Appearances, and I think he pointed out quite well, there's been two major stages of consciousness in history. The first stage of consciousness was hunter-gatherer, Paleolithic consciousness. Hunter-gatherers had direct, intimate participation with their environment, but they didn't have detached awareness. They couldn't make a choice. They were involved in a communal way, but they had no sense of their relationship to things. The second great stage of consciousness that stretched from the Neolithic Revolution through antiquity into the medieval age and now today is the growing awareness of ourselves, a detachment from nature so that we could develop perspective and a sense of relationship. But as we detached ourselves from nature and became aware of ourselves, we lost our communion. We became alienated and detached and separated. And so we in a sense gave up our sense of shared communion and participation. The third great change in consciousness, which would require a great leap by the human species, is a self-aware choice to re-participate, to take our perspective, our sense of relationship, our sophisticated consciousness of the reality of the world, and use that to surrender into a new participation, to rejoin. Now, I think you need balance in all things. Our planetary relationships are no different than our personal relationships. There needs to be a sense of detachment, but also a sense of communion. There needs to be sometimes a sense of removal so that we can make judgments from a distance, but then we should also be willing to rejoin and be intimate and participatory. So our civilization skewed toward the detached, the uninvolved, the remote, all the way to the point of simulation. We need to rejoin. This is not, what I'm saying is not new. The great prophetic figures in Western history, Jesus and Moses and Gandhi, all prophetic leaders in history have gone out in the desert in order to judge themselves in society from a distance, and then have rejoined with a new commitment. Well, each of us mortal people, ordinary human beings, we do that in our own personal lives. Now we have to do it in terms of our philosophy of science and technology. We need to examine our sense of perspective and relationship and rejoin the natural bonds of the planet. So I think that would do a much greater service for our children's generation than thinking of more and then examining our insatiable appetites and believing we can get something out of nothing and that we can overcome limits.
Yeah, that's a very elegant statement. Sorry, we're running out of time. I'm not sure I necessarily agree. We have to maybe do another thing. Whether
I don't always agree with myself.
Never necessarily seen the idea that there is sufficiency is necessarily only an adolescent kind of view of self-satisfaction and so forth. There might be one to be able to see us be able to be inclusive of the whole of the human society in some truly new way that sort of closes quotes on this experience we've been going through for 200,000 years. If there's anyone who's been contributing to an understanding of events in a systematic and responsible way, it's yourself, and I really thank you. Sorry,
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity of talking with you.
And we ought to say very quickly, we're at an event here in New York celebrating the annual Earth Day, which you're involved with, and I congratulate you on all the work on that as well.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you very much. We're happy to have been able to bring you these perceptions of Jeremy Rifkin, one of the leading intellectuals in terms of understanding the evolution of consciousness. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions from the wetlands here in New York City, where they're having a concert, a benefit concert, to mark the upcoming the anniversary of the Earth Day on April 22nd. And also happy to announce that there is a new edition of his incredibly important book, Entropy, coming out soon by the Bantam Company. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions, and we here on Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back then. That's it for this particular segment. Jeremy, once again, thank you very much indeed. Good night. We'll see you next week.